Sorry. Um, so here in this introduction, remember he's telling us he was hated. He gives us specific examples, but again, thinking about point of view, some of these examples, how realistic are they? He does tell us that. Again, if you look here on line 10, in the end, the sneering yellow faces of young men that met me everywhere, the insults hooted after me when I was a safe distance, got badly on my nerves. So think about what this is setting up. He is nervous. He is jittery. He is feels like he's hated. He's got this victim martyr kind of thing going on, right? And again, look at the word choice, these sneering yellow faces. If you want to talk about racism, look at all the times that he describes these people as the other, right? As different. He describes them by things that are tied to their ethnicity and their culture that are different from his. And he does so usually in a way that makes them evil or pagan or lesser, right? And that reveals his own, elitism, right? And then he tells us again about the Buddhist priests, that they were the worst because it seems like they just had nothing to do other than to make his life miserable, right? So then we get this next paragraph, and again, this paragraph is a perfect example of how you develop and prove an idea. So his topic sentence is, all this was perplexing and upsetting, right? And in the next section, what he does is he explains what does he mean by this and perplexing and it's upsetting. And he says, for that time I had already made up my mind that imperialism was an evil thing, and the sooner I chucked up my job and got out of it, the better. So this is why he's being perplexed and upset. He's already decided that he is part of this imperialistic force and it's evil, right? Then he tells us, theoretically and secretly, he was for the Burmese and against their oppressors, the British. And notice how he talks about the British as if he's separate from them, right? He didn't say about us, he says the British, right? That's kind of an interesting way of separating himself from it. And I think also theoretically and secretly are important word choices here. If something is theoretical, then you understand it maybe up here, but you've never put it in practice. So he is, and then it's secret, so it's hidden. So his feelings of support for the Burmese, he's never acted on them, it's theoretical, and he's never spoken about them, it's secret. So when you consider that, it seems a bit, strange that he expects the Burmese to treat him any differently than their oppressors, the British, because it seems like he's never done anything or shared anything that would let them know that he's on their side, right? So that's in a very important passage there. He then talks about his job. So again, what's upsetting and perplexing? Here's another example of proving it. He hates it more bitterly than he can even make clear. And then he gives us reasons why. So now he's going to give us examples to show why he has these feelings. So he talks about the conditions, the way these people are treated, the horrifying, way that they are. And then he also talks about himself, again, proving why he's perplexed, right? So he's upset, but he's kind of not sure why he's perplexed about all of these things, right? He says, I could get nothing into perspective. He says, I had a horrible feeling of guilt, but I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. So he's saying that, I didn't have a lot of experience. I was young. I didn't have enough education, right? I'm just kind of thrown in here, not prepared. And he says, I couldn't even ask for help. They impose on me this silence that I'm just supposed to act like I know everything, right? And so this is why he can't get it into perspective. He has nothing that'll help him understand what's going on to help him decide, well, what's right and what's wrong, right? He's faced by the British that he sees what they're doing, and inside of him he knows that's horrible. We shouldn't be doing that. But on the other side, he has all these Burmese that are treating him bad too, and so he can't really accept them either. He's kind of in this catch-22, right? He says all he knew is that he was stuck between his hatred of the empire that he served, right, and his rage against the evil-spirited little beast who tried to make his job impossible. So again, look at those word choices, right? He says, and part of what made it perplexing, he said, was that he had the idea of the British Raj, so this imperial government, as something that would last forever, in secula secularum, right, for all eternity, right? And think about that. I mean, think about your country, all right? I have a hard time grasping that America would ever end, right? Logically, I know that no empire lasts forever, that there are going to be moments where we're probably going to lose our place and it could be that we might be invaded. I mean, I know that that is possible, but emotionally, I just can't ever imagine. And a lot of that is that I don't want to imagine that thing. So he's kind of got that, even though he sees in front of him that it's horrible, it's evil. He also has this thing like it's never going to die. Because it's been lasting a long time, hundreds of years. The British Empire has been the most powerful country in the world, right? So he's kind of like, well, I can't go up against that. I'm stuck in this system, and this is just the way it is, right? And then he's also looking at the other part, and he has this wanting, he says, to stick a bayonet into these Buddhist priests' guts. I mean, he's got this violent response to them. Like he said, this rage, because they treat him so poorly. And he's like, I'm a victim here too, right? And then what he tells us at the end, right? So remember, he started off, here's what he's trying to prove. He's perplexed and upset. He explains what that means. He gives us examples. And now he's analyzing it, right? This is why. This is the problem. It has led me to this thing that, well, I don't believe it's ever going to end. And I have this rage to react against these people. And then he tells us, and every Englishman, every official feels the same way, right? So he shows that it's not just me. This is a product of this environment, right? In the next paragraph, this is where he then is going to give us the situation that kind of revealed to him all of this. Because you got to ask, he was over there for quite a long time, right? He had to have seen plenty of things, but it's the elephant that he chooses to tell us about, right? So for whatever reason, this is the thing that more clearly explained this or showed him this problem than anything else. And he says that in the very first sentence there. One day something happened which was in a roundabout way enlightening. So it wasn't enlightening in a direct way, right? I went, I had to deal with this elephant, I shot it, it died very horribly and slowly, right? There was nothing directly inherent in that situation. It was in a roundabout way that he realized what was going on. And I think probably the thing is this idea of futility, right? That there he was stuck with dealing with a force stronger than he was. He didn't have the knowledge, the wisdom, the strength to deal with it appropriately. And it ended in a long, agonizing, horrible death. And I think that what he's saying is that maybe this is what's happening in the East with Westerners, right? That they've come over here, they really don't understand what's going on. They're trying to pretend and force it, and what ends up happening is this slow, long, agonizing death, right? And he says it was a tiny incident, but he said it gave him a better glimpse about the real nature of imperialism, the real motives for which despotic governments act. Right, so that's what he's saying. Now, just because he says that's what he gets out of it, again, that doesn't mean that we are limited to that. I mean, you can look at a lot of different things in this story and try to figure out what you think is going on. But he's saying this is why he's talking about it, right? So we get the things that he gets called and told that an elephant has gone must, right? And gone must, you can see the thing is that it's kind of every once in a while male elephants. It might be tied to hormones. I don't know. They go crazy, right? It's an animal that has been domesticated, and the mahouts, the people who control or own the elephants, are supposed to keep them chained and in control. But somehow the elephant broke loose, and by the time he gets this, I don't know how long this has been going on, because we hear that the mahout, when the elephant ran off, the mahout ran and thought he was going one way, and now he's 12 hours away. So if the mahout is on foot, how long did it take him to get 12 hours away from that, right? 12 hours, right? So this elephant has been rampaging for a while, and what's happened while the mahout has been gone, the elephant has reappeared, and it's causing problems. And then we hear at the bottom of this page, the Burmese had no weapons and were quite helpless, right? So this is, again, part of the despotism of the British government, or imperialism, that The people who would know how to handle this are the natives, but they are not allowed weapons to defend themselves. So it falls on to the invaders, the occupiers, the oppressors to handle it, but they don't know what they're doing, right? And so we see that it had raided, it killed a cow, knocked over a hut, raided some fruit stalls, ate some of the stuff. It had caused some damage, right? So then in the next paragraph, we see him and some of the people, again, the Burmese sub-inspector and the Indian constables, going out and trying to figure out what's going on. And we have a description of this area, again, a very poor part of the city, right? And he basically says that that when they started investigating, the closer they get to the actual epicenter of the problem, the more crazy the information becomes. And this is, again, I think, an area where he gives a very indirect sense of cultural elitism or racism. He says, this is on line 61, we began questioning the people as to where the elephant had gone, and as usual failed to get any definite information. That is invariably the case in the East. A story always sounds clear enough at a distance, but the nearer you get to the scene of events, the vaguer it becomes, right? And I think this is an example of racism, because isn't that true anywhere? Wouldn't cops here in America pretty much say the same thing, that the closer you get to the chaos, the harder it is to get any clear? I mean, we know that first-hand witness accounts of things are the most inaccurate kind of details or testimony, right? That people see things from their own perspective, and what they perceive as true can be widely different than what somebody else is, right? So I think when he says this is what happens in the East, this is this little bit of this superiority. Oh, well, we British are much better than that, right? So again, they hear someone in the distance yelling for the children to get away, and when they come around the corner, they see where this Dravidian coolie, so again, this is one of these East Indian immigrants, has been killed, right? And it says that he couldn't have been dead for very long. And we get this really detailed, gruesome description of what he looks like. And it's at this point, now remember, he tells us early that when he left on this, he took his 44 Winchester and he's on a pony, but he knows, he says that 44 is not going to be good enough to take an elephant down. But he's only planning on maybe using it to scare the elephant off if it's trying to maybe charge him, right? He has no intention of shooting the elephant at this point. But at this point, when he sees this dead, gruesome body, this is where he calls for an elephant rifle. He has to borrow one, right? He sends someone to a guy that he knows nearby who has one, and he gets off the horse and he sends it back because he's afraid that the horse will pick up, the fear and will buck him off, right? So here's where he's saying, I'm a little bit scared now for my own life. I don't want to end up like this coolie, right? So the guy comes back with the gun and 5 cartridges. And by this time, some of the Burmese have shown up and told him that the elephant is now in a paddy field. So he goes there, right? And people start following him, right? And he says they had seen the rifle and were all shouting excitedly that I was going to shoot the elephant. This is line 91. They had not shown much interest in the elephant when he was ravaging their homes, but it was different now that he was going to be shot. It was a bit of fun to them, as it would be to an English crowd. So here, it's a horrible thing to say that they were like excited, ooh, entertainment to see the animal shot. But he also admits that this is kind of human nature. It'd be the same in England. And then he says also they wanted the meat. So again, this is a reflection of how poor they are. I mean, here's an elephant that is a working elephant, right? It's understand the context here. Elephants are very important to this culture. Not only are they pieces of equipment, they are helpful, right? They're used to drag those trees down. Most villages of substantial sizes have a working elephant to help them lift and build and clear and do all sorts of things. Elephants are used as transportation, and they're used in rituals and ceremonial situations as well. So for them to be glad that an elephant is going to be shot, again, I think reflects of what's going on in the setting and this time. So they want the meat. It's going to be fun. And he says that it was making him uneasy. He says, because again, he says, I had no intention of shooting it. I really wanted to use the rifle to defend myself in case the elephant charged. right? But he says it was unnerving to have this crowd behind him. So you see this again, this fear, this pressure of he's on stage. He's a performer and he's got to perform. And he really underscores that idea when he talks about being a puppet here in a little bit, right? So he says, I'm marching up and down mountains. I feel like a fool. I got this rifle on my shoulder and all these people finding out at me. And he says, and I get to the elephant and he's peaceful. He's just eating grass. He doesn't look like he's a threat at all. And he says, in this paragraph right here, he says, I knew as soon as I saw him that there's no way I should have killed him. And so here he gives us some thoughts about why he isn't going to kill the elephant. And then back down in this paragraph on the next page, he also gives perfect reasons why he shouldn't kill it, right? So he's starting to have this debate within himself. We see this conflict. I know I shouldn't kill the elephant. I have no reason to it, but the Burmese want me to kill it and expect me to kill it, right? How is he going to resolve this conflict? What is he going to do to make this decision? This is a really important crux in the story, right? So he tells us again, you can look at all the examples that he gives of why he shouldn't shoot it. And he says, and ultimately, I didn't want to shoot it. And he tells us it's not that I'm against hunting. I've been hunting. It's not that I was afraid of it. I just didn't think that was the right thing to do. But then he looks behind him and he sees 2,000 at least of these people behind him. And again, it's the sea of yellow faces above garish clothes. Excuse me. So again, the description of these people, right? And here is an important thing that I think is maybe something that's easy to overlook and not really think about the implications of it. But this next passage is important. He says, they were watching me as though they would watch a conjurer, so a magician, about to perform a trick. They did not like me, but with the magical rifle in my hands, I was momentarily worth watching, right? So the rifle isn't magic, right? A rifle is a piece of technology. We know scientifically why the gun shoots the bullet and why it's destructive, right? So it's only magical to people who don't understand that technology. So by saying that they were looking at him because he had the magical rifle, he's again casting them as unsophisticated, uneducated, backwards, primitive, right? So again, we see some of that elitism kind of coming through here. And we're also seeing how he feels about himself, right? So again, first person narrative. How do we know this is what they were feeling as opposed to what he thinks they're feeling, because this is what he is really feeling. So he might be projecting this onto them. But he's saying that, for a moment, he kind of felt so powerful. And he says, I realized that I should have to shoot the elephant after all. The people expected it of me, and I had got to do it. So here is this idea of futility versus free will. He doesn't want to shoot it, but he feels like he has no choice. He has been put into this corner, and he must shoot it, right? And he says there, this is why this incident is so important. This is why it's enlightening. He says, it was this moment as I stood there with the rifle in my hands that I first grasped the hollowness, the futility of the white man's dominion in the East. So what he then tells us is that here he is, he's the one, the white man, so he's superior. He has much greater knowledge, much more sophistication. He's got the gun, so he has more firepower, right? And yet, he realized that even in the middle of this unarmed crowd, and yeah, they're over 2,000, right? But still, who wants to be the one to take the bullet, right? In the middle of this crowd, he's the one with all the power, and yet he is actually powerless, right? He says, a hollow posing dummy. He calls himself a puppet. He says he's wearing a mask. And they're the ones who are really pulling his strings. He's not powerful at all, because this is what imperialism does, right? He says he must perform the job of the conventionalized sahib, right? Sahib is a word of respect that you got to figure. We're talking about irony. You got to figure that if the Burmese used the word sahib to white men, they weren't being really respectful. It was just all a show, right? But he says, I have a role to perform. My government has told me that I must always look like I'm correct. I cannot admit to error. I cannot ask for help. I always have to look like I'm in control. And in order to do that, I really have to do whatever the crowd wants me to do in order to maintain that facade. And that's why it's futile what they're doing, right? He says he realized that as soon as he had sent for the rifle, that determined what he was going to have to do. Right? That was the moment of no return. He says a Sahib has got to act like a Sahib. He's got to appear resolute, to know his own mind and do definite things. So they weren't going to accept that he got the rifle just as a backup. As soon as he got the rifle, a Sahib would have got it because he knew he was going to have to shoot that one, right? He says, to come all this way, rifle in hand, with 2,000 people marching at my heels, and then to trail feebly away, having done nothing. No, that was impossible. The crowd would laugh at me, and my whole life, every white man's life in the East, was one long struggle not to be laughed at. Again, you have to be dignified. You have to be in control. Right? If they laugh at you, they don't fear you. If they don't fear you, they will not follow your orders, right? Because they don't want you here, right? So again, he goes to this other paragraph where he fights back against that. No, I don't. There's nothing about the elephant. He's not a threat, right? He says here, it would feel like it was murder to shoot him. That's pretty strong, right? And then he thinks about the mahout. I mean, this elephant is this guy's livelihood. Right? So, he's going to be taking that away from him. So he does reflect, I think, this idea that he does sympathize with the Burmese. He does care about them. But he cares about something more than that. He cares about his own self. Right? And so he says it was perfectly clear that he just ought to walk away. Right? But he also knew I wasn't going to do any such thing. He says, I was a poor shot with the rifle and the ground was soft. If he charged and I missed him, I would have about as much chance to get out of him as a toad under a steamroller, right? And he says, and it wasn't even that I was afraid of that. I was more afraid of what would happen if I made a fool of myself with all of these yellow eyes watching me. He says, a white man mustn't be frightened in front of natives, and so in general, he isn't frightened. Right? He psychs himself up to thinking that nothing will scare him because he's not allowed to. I mean, think about that kind of life, right? So he shoots the elephant, right? And he says they give a low, happy sigh when they see he's going to act. And again, the curtain going up in the theater. So again, this idea that he is acting, he's performing for them, right? And so he shoots the elephant, right? And he describes what's happening. He hears the devilish roar of glee. So again, devilish roar. Remember again the word choice, how he's characterizing these people. But he then explains what happens to the elephant. And what he finds out is that he didn't shoot the elephant in the right place. And he continues shooting him, and he kind of sags and the elephant falls to its knees, but he's still not dead. And he takes his gun and he puts the other cartridges in his gun into it. Again, it's not the right way. The Burmans rush by him and watch him slowly dying. He says, I waited a long time for him to die, but his breathing did not weaken. Finally, I fired my 2 remaining shots into the spot where I thought his heart would be, right? And then he went back and got his small rifle, and he poured shot after shot into his heart and down his throat. But that didn't seem to affect it, right? And finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He leaves, and he later learned that it took the elephant half an hour to die, and then the Burmans came, and they basically stripped the meat down to the bone, right? So again, if he didn't want to look foolish, we got to ask ourselves, did he actually accomplish that by killing the elephant? Because he looked foolish. He didn't know what he was doing. So this last paragraph is the conclusion. It's what happened. It's, okay, what happened because of this? And he basically tells us that, boy, they sure talked a lot. There was endless discussion. The older Brits thought he did the right thing, right? The owner was mad, right? But the owner was an Indian himself, and so he didn't have any rights. The younger soldiers thought that I had killed the elephant, and that was a mistake because that was a valuable piece of property, and all it had done was kill a worthless coolie, right? And then he says legally he was in the right because it had killed a man, and if the elephant was mad and the owner couldn't control it, then that was the recourse legally, right? But he tells us that he was really glad the coolie died because it actually gave him a legal line, right? Even though the coolie's life didn't have a whole lot of value, it still had technically killed, right? And so he could maybe use as excuse, well, if he wouldn't have stopped there, he might have killed someone that actually was important, right? He says it gave him sufficient pretext for shooting the elephant. But then here's the confessional part of this. He says, I often wondered whether any of the others grasped that I had done it solely to avoid looking a fool. So this is where he tells us, this is, again, remember he says it was enlightening, the story about what happened. And this is what happens with imperialism, that people do horrible, horrible things in order to look good, in order to maintain some illusion of power. And he says that, even though he had all this justification, his real motivation is he just didn't want to look like a fool, right? And so there's your story. Again, there are just so many things that you can explore here. You can think about, what is significant about the cultural conflict here. What is the motivation for him to act that's driven by his being British, by his being other, right? Where is he acting because he feels like he has to act because of other people's expectations? Right? Where is he doing it to himself? Where is he giving up free will when he could have free will? He could have chosen something different. He would have had consequences, right? But I think what he understands, remember, you have two Orwells in this story. You have the Orwell who was telling the story 10 years after this event happened, roughly, right? The wiser Orwell who has had time to think about it and ponder and reflect. Then you have the Orwell who is the 19-year-old that is actually in the middle reacting in real time, right? And I think that the older Orwell is telling us that, he now realizes that he only did it to look like a fool. And why did he make that choice? I think that's one of the reasons that he wrote the story. He's trying to figure out why. Why would someone do something like this? And his answer is that, well, it's imperialism is an evil thing. And it's destructive to everybody inside it, not just the people who are being oppressed, the natives, but imperialism is oppressive even to the oppressors, right? It has taken away, just as it has taken away the Burmese rights to act and choose for themselves, it has also taken away Orwell's right to act and choose for himself. They are all so rigidly involved in this battle. Everybody has this defined role, and he has no right to act out of it according to his training, right? And he's saying that that's bad, right? Okay, so your next step is thinking about possible themes and then crafting thesis statements and topic sentences to support whatever way you want to interpret it. You'll see examples of those things. You'll see example of an essay for this assignment to kind of give you an idea of what to do and how to use those quotes and sources from the story to back up. So look at that example, not necessarily to see about what to write, but how to put this all together. Look at how in the body paragraphs I make a clear statement to support my thesis, I explain it, and then I use pieces from the story to support it, and then I give you the takeaway about then what does all this mean, okay? So I'll look forward to reading your essays.